The morning of May the 23rd, 2020, in West Derby, a suburb of Liverpool, was no different from any other. Neat semi-detached houses lined the quiet streets, creating an illusion of safety and order. At around 9:30 a.m, an unremarkable white van pulled up on Croxteth Road West. A man dressed in a courier uniform stepped out, holding a package, and confidently walked toward one of the houses. If any neighbours had noticed him at all, they would have seen nothing more than a routine delivery. But this was no delivery, it was the beginning of the end. As soon as the door was opened by the home's occupant, Paul Glenn, three shadows appeared behind the courier. Their faces were hidden by black balaclavas, and in their hands were not envelopes or clipboards, but long, menacing machetes. The invasion was swift and brutal. Glenn and his son, who was inside the house, had no time to react. The attackers struck with cold, calculated fury, inflicting wounds that cut down to the bone. From the outside, the house looked like any ordinary family home. Inside, it had become the scene of a bloodbath, but the attackers weren't there for lives. At least not yet. They were there for the goods. This house wasn't a typical family residence. In the criminal hierarchy of Merseyside, it was known as a stash house, a crucial storage point for narcotics. And the robbers knew exactly what they were after. Fighting through the resistance, they quickly found their target: 30-kilogram-sized bricks of high-grade cocaine. Just 4 minutes after the courier rang the doorbell, they were already loading the haul into the van. Their score was worth over £1 million on the black market. With the engine roaring to life, the van vanished into the morning traffic as quickly as it had appeared, leaving behind a blood-soaked house and the opening scene of one of the most dramatic sagas in the history of British organised crime. A story about how one brazen robbery ignited a chain reaction of paranoia, vengeance, and ultimately the downfall of an entire empire. News of the raid spread through the invisible channels of the criminal underworld like wildfire. It reached the ears of the man who owned that stash house, and everything in it. His name was Vincent Coggins. In the ecosystem of British crime, Coggins was an apex predator. Alongside his brother Francis, he had led a syndicate known as the Huyton Firm for decades. It wasn't just a name, it was a brand, a synonym for absolute power and unthinkable brutality. Stories of Coggins' methods were whispered from mouth to mouth, serving as grim warnings to anyone even considering crossing him. Torture for overdue debts, blackmail of rivals, the quiet disappearances of those who asked too many questions. It was all part of his legacy. His empire was built on fear, and that fear was his most valuable asset. And now, someone had dared to strike at the very heart of that empire. When Coggins watched the footage from a neighbour's CCTV camera, his reaction was exactly what those who knew him would expect. An explosive, uncontrollable fury. But beneath that rage lay a calculating mind. He understood immediately. This couldn't have been the work of outsiders. No gang from Manchester, Birmingham, or London would have been bold, or foolish, enough to invade his territory so brazenly. That left only one possibility: betrayal. Someone within his circle, someone who knew about the stash, its value, and the way it was guarded, had decided to challenge the king. In his increasingly paranoid mind, that idea became an obsession. This wasn't just a robbery, it was a personal insult, a public slap in the face that could not go unanswered. Coggins gave the order. Find the name, no matter the cost. What he didn't know was that his wrath was already aimed in the wrong direction, and that would become his first fatal mistake. In the murky waters of criminal rumour, truth is the first thing to drown. Before long, a name landed on Vincent Coggins' desk: Brian Maxwell Jr. There was no evidence, no witnesses, no motive. Just someone's word and Coggins' growing conviction that Maxwell's quiet, calculated style made him the perfect mastermind behind such a bold operation. The verdict was handed down: a death sentence. Word of this reached Brian Maxwell Sr, the father of the accused. Maxwell Sr was a major figure in his own right, though of a very different breed. He was known as a farmer, a shadowy mogul who had built a fortune through large-scale cannabis cultivation in dozens of properties across the region. He was a pragmatist who understood exactly what kind of world he operated in, and he knew his son. He knew Brian Jr had nothing to do with the robbery, and he even had proof. Footage from a home security camera showing his son, hadn't left the house on the day of the raid. But he also knew that for a man like Coggins, evidence meant nothing compared to wounded pride. Trying to plead innocence would be as good as signing his own death warrant. So Maxwell Sr. made what he believed was the only possible move. He decided to speak Coggins' language. Not the language of justice, but of power and money. Through a trusted intermediary, he reached out to the Huyton Firm with an unprecedented offer. He would take full responsibility, admit to his son's fabricated guilt, and pay for it. Pay in full. Documents for properties, stacks of cash, various assets. Everything was put on the table. The total ransom for his son's life came to £1.3 million. It was a desperate attempt to buy peace, to extinguish the wildfire of Coggins' wrath with money, and to save his family from annihilation. The negotiations were tense, but the deal was made. Maxwell Sr. fulfilled every part of the agreement to the last penny. The assets were handed over. The money was paid. For a brief moment, it seemed the disaster had been averted. Maxwell Sr. believed he had bought forgiveness. His son, hiding in fear, could finally breathe again. But they had made a deal with the devil, and the devil doesn't play by the rules. While his men were collecting the money, Vincent Coggins was reaching for his EncroChat phone. These encrypted devices, worth thousands of pounds, were a status symbol in the upper ranks of the criminal world. They were believed to be uncrackable, a digital fortress where the most candid conversations could take place without fear of exposure. And it was in this secure chat that Coggins revealed his true intentions. "I'll take the money, but it changes nothing," he wrote to his closest lieutenants. "That pup is still going to get what's coming to him." To Coggins, the ransom was just a welcome bonus. It didn't cancel the need for a message, a brutal, public one. The insult to his honour couldn't be washed away with money, only with blood. He ordered his men to lay low, to wait for the noise to settle, and then to track down Brian Maxwell Jr. and finish the job. He was determined to send a message the entire underworld would remember. You don't cross Vincent Coggins. The Maxwells, having paid a fortune, had only bought themselves time, unaware that the sword of Damocles still hung, silently and steadily, over their son's head. While Coggins plotted his revenge, confident in his complete anonymity, a quiet revolution was unfolding in the digital world, one that would permanently change the rules of the game. The EncroChat network, which he and thousands of criminals across Europe believed to be an impenetrable fortress, had already been compromised. In a brilliant and highly classified operation, French and Dutch cyber gendarmes managed to install a Trojan horse on EncroChat's servers. They gained access to the network's master encryption key. From that moment on, every call, every message, every photo sent through EncroChat became fully visible to law enforcement. Criminals continued to pay for the illusion of security, unaware that their fortress had turned into a massive trap. This unprecedented intelligence operation was given the codename Operation Venetic in the UK. Data from the hacked servers poured into the National Crime Agency, NCA, and its regional task forces. For detectives in northwest England, who had spent years trying to penetrate the Huyton Firm, it was the equivalent of acquiring a superpower. Suddenly, they could read their enemies' minds. They saw how Coggins, under the alias Moonlit Boat, gave orders to monitor targets. They watched his men discuss buying grenades and handguns. They read in chilling detail their plans for the upcoming hit on Brian Maxwell Jr. The very technology that once gave criminals a godlike sense of invincibility had become the tool of their downfall. Police were no longer investigating past crimes. They were witnessing future ones unfold in real time. As detectives pored over the gang's encrypted messages, two things became increasingly clear. First, the threat to Brian Maxwell Jr.'s life was very real and imminent. Second, he had absolutely nothing to do with the warehouse robbery. By analysing conversations from other criminal cells, police began to piece together what had really happened on May 23rd. The trail led them to the nearby city of Salford and to two known criminal brothers, Jason and Craig Cox. These were the men who had carried out the violent raid. But the key question remained: how did they know about Coggins' stash house in Liverpool? The answer lay in their accomplice, a local career criminal named Richard Caswell. Caswell was the perfect inside man. He operated deep within Liverpool's criminal circles, knew all the rumours, all the deals, and it was he who fed the Cox brothers the crucial intel about Coggins' account stash. But what made Caswell truly dangerous was the double game he played after the robbery. Immediately after the heist, Caswell contacted Coggins' people and offered to help find those responsible. He played his part flawlessly, steering them toward false leads, feeding their paranoia, and subtly encouraging suspicions against innocent parties. All the while he was funneling information straight back to the Cox brothers, keeping them one step ahead of the syndicate's wrath. But like Coggins, Caswell had placed far too much faith in his EncroChat phone. In his own boastful messages, where he casually discussed the robbery's details and his role in it, police found irrefutable evidence of his guilt. He had bragged about manipulating Coggins, misleading his gang, and orchestrating the entire setup behind the scenes. The mystery of the robbery, one that had cost the Maxwells a fortune and nearly a life, had finally been solved. By the end of May 2020, detectives found themselves in an incredibly delicate position. They had concrete evidence of a planned, brutal murder, but they couldn't act on it directly. Arresting Vincent Coggins based solely on EncroChat data would immediately expose the source, potentially collapsing Operation Venetic across all of Europe. They needed to act unconventionally, save Brian Maxwell Jr.'s life without letting the criminals know they were being watched. The police opted for a psychological strategy, a mind game. The first step was an official visit to Brian Maxwell Jr. He was handed an Osman warning, a formal document issued when police have credible intelligence that someone's life is under imminent threat. For the Maxwells, who thought the nightmare had passed, it was a devastating confirmation. The deal with the devil had only bought time, not safety. Next came an even bolder move, a direct approach to the hunters themselves. Detectives served disruption notices to Coggins and his two top lieutenants, Paul Woodford and Robert Jarvis. These were not arrests but thinly veiled messages. We know. We're watching. One wrong move and you're done. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. Coggins and his crew were rattled. How did the police know? Had someone flipped? Were their phones bugged? The uncertainty was paralysing. Not knowing the source of the leak, they froze. They halted all operations and went underground. This pause, born of fear and confusion, was exactly what the police needed. It bought them time to coordinate a final, crushing blow. While Coggins and his men scrambled to make sense of the invisible threat, law enforcement prepared to end the game they had been silently winning from the shadows. While the Huyton Firm scrambled to uncover the source of the leak, time was working against them. Detectives from Operation Sub-Zero used the precious days they had gained to finalise their case. Thousands of messages were cross-referenced. Financial transactions were traced. Every key figure in the syndicate was identified. Judgment Day had come. At dawn on June 16, 2020, armed tactical teams struck simultaneously at dozens of addresses across Liverpool and its surrounding areas. It was one of the largest and most coordinated police operations the region had ever seen. Vincent Coggins, a man who had inspired fear for decades, was pulled from his own home. His closest lieutenants were arrested within the hour. The firm's command structure, once thought unshakable, was decapitated in a matter of hours. The arrests were carried out with surgical precision, quiet, swift, and leaving no room to run or destroy evidence. For Merseyside's criminal underworld, it was an earthquake. An empire built on violence and fear didn't fall in a blaze of gang warfare. It collapsed under the weight of its own digital secrets, exposed by an invisible enemy. The age of the Huyton Firm was over. The trials that followed the arrest became a true test of the British justice system's resilience. At the heart of the courtroom battles was one defining question. Was the use of EncroChat evidence lawful? Defence lawyers argued it was a mass violation of privacy rights, an unprecedented breach of civil liberties. But the court delivered a landmark ruling. The evidence obtained through the EncroChat hack was admissible. That decision opened the floodgates, leading to hundreds of convictions across the country. For the Huyton Firm, it marked the definitive end. Vincent Coggins was sentenced to 28 years in prison. His lieutenants received sentences ranging from 11 to 25 years. The real perpetrators of the robbery, the Cox brothers and Richard Caswell, were also convicted and jailed. But this was no tale of justice triumphing cleanly over evil. the Maxwells' fate would become the most tragic chapter of all. During the investigation, their own criminal enterprise, a large-scale cannabis operation, was uncovered. Brian Maxwell Sr, the father who had sacrificed everything to save his son, was sentenced to 13 years in prison. Brian Maxwell Jr, the original target and victim of extortion, received 18 years, largely for illegal weapons possession. He had bought the firearms in panic, still believing that hitmen were coming for him, and the £1.3 million, the ransom meant to buy his life, was seized by the state. In this war, no one walked away a winner. This wasn't a story of heroes and villains, only of broken lives, costly mistakes, and different shades of guilt and tragedy.